Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Christine here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3, Immortal Empires, and the kind of changes that Creative Assembly could make in order to improve the Confederation mechanic. Now, I'm not saying they should make these changes, but I am just throwing ideas out there about what Creative Assembly could do to make the mechanic far more interesting than it currently is. Confederations can be fun, especially if you're confederating legendary lords. They give you more territory, they give you more power, you get access to their special skill line, but the way the confederations work right now, for the most part, is not particularly great. I mean, yes, Karl Franz does have an exception with this for the unifying mechanic. Then you can also look at the dwarves and chaos dwarves, who can also guarantee confederations with major factions that are part of their race. But the way the confederations work inherently in the game is not particularly great from my perspective. So first off, when we look at a faction and we want to confederate, we can see over here the evaluation breakdown of how the AI is going to view such a deal. And we can see baseline evaluation minus 135, relative faction strength, and then of course diplomatic prospects. Now, baseline evaluation is determined by your relationship with a faction, but this caps out at 150 diplomatic relations. So any kind of diplomatic deal that you make with an AI faction will be determined by whether or not they like you. So if they hate you, they're going to be less willing to deal with you. If they like you, they're going to be more willing to deal with you. It's that simple. Problem is that this caps out at 150. So once you get to 150, the baseline evaluation is still going to be in the negative, but it's going to be far less than it is over here at minus 135. That is a bit of a problem because the only way to overcome that is by being stronger than an opposing faction. Of course, having good relations, having a long-lasting alliance, all that kind of stuff will help, but ultimately you need to be stronger than an AI faction to guarantee confederation. This already is a problem. Not with the minor factions, those are easy enough to deal with, but with the major factions, because major factions can hold a lot of territory, have a good strength ranking on the campaign map, and that will make dealing with confederations with them pretty annoying. But it's not really that simple either, because there is a hidden penalty with regards to confederations if an AI faction is conquering territory. There is a temporary penalty introduced if, say, I want to confederate Elspeth and I want to do it for diplomacy, which obviously I can't as Karl Franz, but I can do it as Geld Volkmar and Marcus Wolfhard. But if I want to, say, for instance, confederate Elspeth, the problem that's going to happen here is that she's likely going to take territory pretty constantly in a campaign. Now, and that's going to introduce a temporary penalty. You can still overcome that, but if a faction is strong and they're conquering territory, it gets that much harder to confederate them. This creates a kind of situation where the best option for a confederation in the early game, which is the most interesting part of the campaign, or just confederation in general, is to screw over your AI allies, quote unquote. And how do you screw them over? You take territory that they would naturally conquer. You deliberately sell them territory in order to bankrupt them. You cheese the game. And whatever perspective one might have with respect to cheesing the game, I think we can all agree that it's not a great situation when playing the game requires cheesing. Cheesing will always be part of the game, but when it is required to get something done, that is not a great situation. And that is really my problem with confederations. It feels less like a natural build-up of an alliance and a faction joining you, and more like, how can I cheese and abuse this faction in order to get it done? So what do I think Creative Assembly could do with respect to that? Well, I think a system that kind of works like the Chaos Dwarves, or works like the regular Dwarves, or Karl Franz's unification would be great for every faction, for every race, one way or another. Maybe appropriate to the race. I gotta say, I'm not particularly fond of the way Greenskins and Norska confederate, or even the Subjugation Confederation of Warriors of Chaos, but some kind of system would be good in this respect. Maybe, we pay some measure of gold. But of course, Bretonnia does this. Like, the way you confederate to Bretonnia, you research something, then you can pay a sum of gold. It's not particularly great either, because you have to spend time researching in order to get confederations with both minor and major factions. Many of these minor factions get wiped out, so you're wasting time researching stuff. But the idea behind Bretonnia's confederation, the idea that at one point, once you reach a certain threshold, and it doesn't matter what that threshold is, but once you reach a threshold, and maybe it should be different compared to what it currently is. But that idea that you reach a certain point and you can pay money or unique faction resources in order to get the Confederation, that would be a good system. Maybe a bit more expensive for Legendary Lords than minor factions, or a lot more expensive, like double the cost. It already is higher cost for major factions versus minor factions for Bretonnia. I feel like minor factions for Bretonnia should be cheaper than they are, and major factions should be, 10,000. Something along those lines, because you're going to gain significant benefits through that process. So Bretonnia does offer a solution. Unification offers a solution. The dwarf mechanic offers a solution. And all of these things can work. So how Creative Assembly decides to handle things going forward, regardless of that, it would be good to just have a system in the game that is not about abusing the game systems, but rather something that does happen naturally. And I understand the intent behind Creative Assembly trying to stop us from confederating Legendary Lords. I get that. It, one, doesn't work because you can cheese your way through it, and two, even if it were to work as intended, it just means that you're only gonna get those confederations with major factions much later on in your campaign, by the time it's just fluff. That is perhaps a bigger issue about like early game campaigns not being as relevant. That early game campaigns are far more relevant than late game campaigns. That is perhaps a bigger issue that Creative Assembly needs to fix. I don't know how they can fix it. There's various options like scaling of difficulty as you play in a campaign, that kind of stuff. So that's the first thing with respect to a confederation. The second thing that I would really like to see with confederations would be climate. So say, for instance, you're playing a campaign as Karl Franz, and you go and confederate Gelt, which, by the way, you can for certain. You just need to get Emperor of the Empire, then this particular decree gets upgraded to allowing you to confederate all Imperial factions, so you certainly can. Well, what would be great is if we could get mountain climate, because Gelt does have mountain climate. So it would be really good if we could get the kind of climate that the factions we're confederating have access to. Or if we're confederating Marcus Wolfart, this may be a bit surprising for some people to hear, but Marcus Wolfart has suitable climate in temperate islands, so you can take all of Wolfan. Whether or not you'd want to do that in an Imperial campaign, that's a different discussion, but it's certainly something that would be useful. Or Volkmar has Wasteland available in his campaign. So I think, like, in general, with every race, it would be great to get those kind of climates. I understand the idea behind the climate system. They want us to have campaigns focused on a certain part of the map. The problem is, many parts of the map are way too freaking small. And you end up in a situation where just pushes further with that issue that the early game is far more important than the late game, because once you get to a point in many campaigns, you just end up with less territory to conquer, or uninhabitable or unpleasant territory, and it's just not worth dealing with it. Like, this is one of the problems in Grom's campaign. So I understand the intent behind what the developers have done, but I think, like, in general with climate, not just for confederations, it would be great at one point to, I don't know, research the ability of making uninhabitable climate habitable. You know, some kind of limitations maybe with chaotic wasteland, I get that, but like frozen, okay, that is okay. You can take frozen, but you can take mountains potentially. That's, by the way, something Gelt can do. It is a bit of a bizarre situation, so I think like just an improvement to the climate system would be better. Then, on top of that, with respect to confederations, the third thing, it would be the idea of getting their faction mechanics. Because, for instance, if I'm playing an Elspeth campaign, or a Gelt campaign for that matter, I can really enjoy these campaigns from an early game perspective, because they do have those unique armies, they do have those unique mages. If you're playing Gelt, that's certainly a good amount of power. But here's the problem. Karl Franz, if you're playing a longer campaign, is the best campaign of the Empire, because he has that kind of scalability of his empire for Electrocounts, for Emperor's Decree, through diplomacy. He has that level of power, and he has that guaranteed confederation. So I think in general, with respect to confederation of Legendary Lords, you should gain their faction power. So if you're confederating Elspeth, for instance, you would gain the Amethyst Armory. If you're confederating Gelt, as another example, you would be able to get his mages, the Colleges of Magic. If you're getting Volkmar, you can get Zeal. I don't know, or some version of it. Now, mind you, this would be a lot of work, I don't deny it. You'd have to change the UI. Maybe instead of just having like the faction effects over here and the resources, you could just create a new tab that you'd have to open to see those resources and faction effects. That might work, I think, and you could add tabs as you confederate, but I think this would add so much for replayability. I understand that Creative Assembly wants to keep factions, races, and Legendary Lords unique, but I think within a particular race, it would just make sense if in the long term you would be able to get that. I think it would add a lot of replayability. You know, if I'm playing an Elspeth campaign, it would give me more reason to play an Elspeth campaign as opposed to fewer reasons. Because you could take the view, well, if that's the case, right, why wouldn't I play a Karl Franz campaign? Well, there's plenty of reasons you would want to play an Elspeth campaign or a Gelf campaign in that situation, because if you could get Karl Franz's faction power, it's one, easier to begin with, it's a more straightforward path, and you do have those unique armies that can be really fun to use, or those unique mages, whereas Karl has the Empire. There would be plenty of reasons to still play these factions, and it would really help make for a better campaign experience in general, because you'd be adding the uniqueness of other Legendary Lords and other factions to your own. Like, imagine playing a campaign as Tretch and getting access to Icheclaw's nuclear arsenal. And wouldn't that make Tretch a bit more interesting to play? It is just an idea. And finally, what I think would be great to have would be the ability of gaining vision with other Legendary Lord factions in your particular race. Because having to send heroes to just see them, that is a bit annoying. If you can see them, you can more easily get confederations, but just some kind of mechanic to be able to get that vision, you know, even if it's a research or expenses or something like that, even if you have to pay resources, it would be something that would be really useful. That is my perspective with regards to confederations. So climate, ease of confederations, faction effects added if you confederate a particular Legendary Lord, and then yeah, just having vision with these factions. It would be a lot more fun from my perspective, as opposed to the cheese that we have right now. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.